Well, I told you there would be three decisions of Marshall that I would talk about. And the first one was Marbury versus Madison, which upheld the right of the Supreme Court to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. And the second was McCulloch versus Maryland, in which John Marshall, as a good old-fashioned Federalist, a good old Hamiltonian Federalist, even though the Federalist Party had disappeared, but he's still there saying that the United States is a single nation, that the Congress is the supreme government, that Congress has supremacy over state legislatures, and you know, we're not a federation of states. States don't have the power to overrule an act of Congress, and specifically the Bank of the United States is constitutional. Now, the third case raises another issue that I haven't talked very much about in this class, and I wish I'd had more time, because it's really an important issue. And you know, I've had to make so many cuts to fit in with the new time and all this other stuff. And so I haven't given this the attention that I would like to give to it. It involves Indians. And we've talked about this, and you know that since the very beginning, you understand that what Europeans did, and now their descendants, the Americans, their whole strategy had always been to move Indians out west, to get them off the land and say that this land is for white people. And a justification for that, since from day one, if you remember very early in the class, the first couple of weeks, one of the reasons why the English said back in 1607, why they said that it was all right to force Indians out, was because the Indians were primitives, they were not civilized, and sort of a measure of civilization was private ownership of land. And Indians didn't believe in that. That was not part of their culture. And so the English insisted that that meant that they were not civilized. They were not entitled to use the land. The land had to be used in English style, which means small farms. And the Indians didn't believe in that, so that means that they're primitive and they don't deserve it. So they have to leave and then go somewhere else and have their culture, but they can't have it here because this is only for civilized people. And that's been a standard argument, and it's been used over and over again, and we just keep moving the Indians further west and further west and further west and further west. And all the time its justification is that, well, they're just primitives, they're uncivilized, and so that people who are going to use the land the right way, use the land as private property and as the key to freedom, owning your own land and everything, all the other stuff that we've talked about, that's been going on forever. And I mentioned to you then, a challenge to that came in around 1810, 1811, when Tecumseh tried to rally the Indians of the Northwest, where he was from, into a confederation that would unite Indians to resist that by force if necessary. And so there was that time there when Tecumseh was blocking expansion. Didn't last very long. Tecumseh was killed during the War of 1812, and his confederation fell apart. And the Indians of the Northwest, if you will, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but just to keep it easy here, the Indians of the Northwest were defeated. They lost. They had to move west. It's like everybody else. It's the same old story. And so people like the Shawnee and the Winnemucca and the other Indians of Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, were moved other places in the West out to what is now the modern day state of Kansas or Oklahoma, out further west. And that's back to normal there. But the Indians of the Southeast adopted a slightly different strategy. There were 5 tribes in the Southeast, of which the largest were the Cherokee. So I'm just going to focus on the Cherokee. And the Cherokee and the other tribes, the Choctaw and the Crow, and so on and so forth, they said, look, in a sense what they're saying, if you can't beat them, join them. Instead of trying to resist them, they said, let's oppose white people taking over our land by using some of his own procedures. If if the argument is that we're not civilized, and that's why we have to leave because it's only for civilized people, we'll become civilized. And so these tribes became known as the 5 civilized tribes. And what civilization meant was, first of all, obviously, adopt private ownership of land. Become small farmers. Become like Americans, you know. All Americans are a nation of small farmers. We'll become small farmers. So they adopted that, but then they went a little bit further and try to show that this is where they are, that they are civilized, and you can't just expel them because they're not. They adopted written languages. They of course had the language the whole time, but they put it into a written format and started publishing documents using their language. So they've got a language like your Americans did, and they drafted constitutions for their nations. So there's a constitution for the Cherokee Nation, and it's a written document that's sort of modeled after the U.S. Constitution. Hey, if the sign of a civilized people is you've got this constitution, we've got a constitution. Some of them became Christians. That's really adopting white man's way. There were a number of missionaries who came out onto Cherokee land and established missions and did win some converts. So there are functioning Christian churches within Cherokee territory. Their agriculture was like white man's agriculture. And in the southeast, I haven't talked too much about this, but you might know that the product that they're raising is something that I've mentioned. It's cotton. I mean, that's the big thing. And especially now, we're into the 1810s, the 1820s. We're into the whole textile industrial revolution. And cotton is increasingly popular. It's growing and growing. And so Cherokees grew cotton. That's white man's agriculture. That's our agriculture. That's civilized agriculture. That's our agriculture. And some of them even adopted what came along with the production of cotton, which is a big theme, of course, here that we're going to have to spend a lot of time talking about, and that's slavery. So some Cherokee even owned slaves. Some of the larger Cherokee farmers had slaves. Owning slaves is a sign of civilization. And then as a nation with their own constitution, their own sort of national government set up, they began negotiating with the United States government. And I told you the United States position had always been that the Indians were like sovereign nations. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress was responsible for negotiations with the Indians because the Indians were sort of treated as nations. And so what the Cherokee and the other civilized tribes are saying is, hey, if that's the way you want it, that's the way we'll do it. We will be nations. We've got our constitution. We've got a government here as a national government. And we'll enter into negotiations with you. And so in 1825, when John Quincy Adams was president of the United States, we'll get to that one later. But John Quincy Adams negotiated a treaty with the Cherokee and the other tribes, granting them sovereignty over vast areas of land in the southeast. Most significantly in the state of Georgia, in western parts of Georgia, away from the coast, but throughout Alabama and Mississippi and other parts of the southeast, where the 5 civilized tribes are now the legal government, according to a treaty with the U.S. government, the Treaty of Washington of 1825, between the Adams administration, the Cherokee, and the other civilized tribes. So they've got a treaty recognizing their sovereignty over their territory. Well, of course, there were a lot of white people who wanted that land, especially now in the 1820s, when this whole industrial revolution that I talked about last week is really starting to gain momentum. The United States economy is booming. Henry Clay's American system is working. The bank is functioning and financing all of the purchases of land. The tariffs are protecting the textile industry. The textile industry is booming. Cotton production is booming. Cities are booming. Industrialization is underway. The transportation movement that I discussed last week is really taking on. The country is booming. But one of the things that making it go is the production of cotton. And there's a lot of people who want that Indian land because it's really good land for cotton production. And remember, cotton can only grow in the South because of natural factors. So that's the land, man, that's what we want, and the Indians have got some really good land. So white people were after that land, and especially the state of Georgia is representing these white people who are trying to get the Indians out of their land in Georgia. So the state of Georgia passed a number of laws, the state legislature passed a number of laws that were designed to sort of harass and undermine and weaken what would be the Cherokee nation, their nation as recognized by the Treaty of Washington. And they're trying to nibble away at that in one way or another. One of the ways they want to nibble away at that is to require missionaries, pastors, preachers in Indian land, or throughout the state of Georgia, including what was recognized as the territory of the Indian nations, the pastors had to get a license to practice and to preach from the state of Georgia. Well, there was a pastor in Georgia who said, wait a minute, I don't have to get a license from the state of Georgia. He was a white man, but his name was Worcester. That's another one of those names I'll have to put on the list for you. Worcester, it doesn't spell like it sounds. But Worcester said, wait a minute, I don't have to get a license from the state of Georgia to preach. He was one of those pastors who was preaching to the Indians, to have his church in what was Indian territory according to the Treaty of 1825. So he charged that this was an illegal act, and he sued the state of Georgia, saying, I don't have to get a license from you guys. The Indians have sovereignty over what I do, and if I need a license from anybody, I don't know if I need a license, but if I do, I get it from the Cherokees. So he sued in federal court, and the case went on appeal to the United States Supreme Court. In 1830, the case of Worcester versus Georgia. Well, think about this one. I think maybe you can figure this one out. This is a case where there is a federal law. In this case, it's not an act of Congress, it's a treaty. But a treaty is a federal law, and a state legislature is trying to overrule that federal law. The state legislature is trying to say, we're deciding who can practice the profession of ministry within the state, even though that's recognized by treaty as Cherokee territory. Well, the case went to John Marshall. What do you think he's going to decide? Well, this is one of many cases where Marshall had to decide which was supreme, the federal government or a state legislature. Is the United States a single nation or a federation of states where a state legislature still can overrule the national government? Well, it's a no-brainer. In all of those cases, Marshall is a hardcore, good old-fashioned Hamiltonian federalist. Federal supremacy is always over state law. So he ruled that the state of Georgia's law was illegal, that Worcester, at least in that specific case, it only applied to that one person in that one issue, but Worcester didn't have to get a license from the state of Georgia, that the treaty overrode state law. So that was the case of Worcester versus Georgia. Now I mentioned that now because we're going to get back to it, and we're going to be hearing more about Indians. But I'm just going to leave it now. I wanted to take it up as part of this whole issue of Marshall as the long-standing Federalist, still upholding the principle that the United States was a single nation, and specifically that meant that the state of Georgia could not overrule a federal treaty. Okay, now I want to get back to the work of the era of good feeling and the political situation there, where the Republicans are now the only party, the Republicans of Henry Clay, and they dominate the federal government. They're the only party, so they run the country. And we've talked about the ways that they do that in terms of specifically of Clay's American system, and the three features of it are of course, as the Bank of the United States, the tariffs, and the federal government engaged in internal improvements, building transportation as part of the whole economic development of the United States, as moving into industrialization. And that's the way things are in Congress and in the national government. And as I said, Monroe was reelected unanimously in 1820. Well, now we have to kind of look at this whole idea of the era of good feeling. It's misleading. Yeah, there's only one party. There's no party division. We don't have two parties that are against each other, as we'd had with the Federalists and the Republicans. The Federalists are gone. But what's happened instead is that there are many divisions within the Republican Party. There are many factions. So it's not, Federalist versus Republican as it had been in all of our elections since 1796. It had always been, Jefferson versus Adams, Madison versus whoever, and so forth. What we have is Republican versus Republican versus Republican versus Republican. There were several different wings, if you will, or factions within the Republican Party. And as we came to the election of 1824, the Republican Party was fragmented into different factions. And this is a little bit complicated, and I don't have the time here to get into it all, but I'll just mention there are four Republicans running for president. One who's going to be sort of not known as a guy named Crawford from Georgia. And then there was John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, who had been Secretary of State for President Monroe. And then there was Henry Clay, who's a member of the House of Representatives. And then there was a guy from Tennessee named Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had become a senator, and he'd become a politician based on his popularity as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. So the election of 1824 is very bitter, with four people all running as Republicans. It's four wings of the Republican Party, and it's a very bitter battle. And one of the things that I want to mention is that by 1824, one of the things that's happened is that most states, almost all states, now allow the people of their state to elect the electors. The Constitution says that each state can decide how they choose their electors for the Electoral College. Every state is now letting the people vote. So there's such a thing as the popular vote.